Ben and Ruth, who didn't come into the conversation, but I'm sure will, I think have really talked about the essence of the housing problem, which is the way housing policy has been taken over by the corporates, by Tory ideology, and as Ben so eloquently showed, what we are seeing now is the rhinocerosification of the Labour Party, or the bourgeoisification, to use these horrible words, of the Labour Party, but you know what I mean. I mean, we have adopted their ideology. And what is the Labour Party for? And this is a very, very key area. I think housing is the single biggest repository of social misery in Britain today. And I think it all goes back to Thatcher's sell-off of a very large number of council homes, leading to the deterioration of council estates, where people have lived happily for years and want to stay, and leaving, we were told in 1997, a bill of about £19 billion for repairs and maintenance. So in comes New Labour, and what do? First of all, they maintain the very low level of house build, which is absolutely crucial in this whole question. They continue with the Tory policy, indeed accelerate it, of privatisation, bullying many housing associations, bullying local authorities to sell off or just even to hand over billions of public sector property to housing associations. That's what happened. And of course the result is that there is a growing shortage of housing, which is utterly predictable for the people who need it most. Galloping house prices for those who would prefer to buy. Soaring private rents for those who are forced into the private sector, nearly always unwillingly. And of course the rising waiting lists. Waiting lists which are 1.8 million in the council sector, and if you include housing associations, probably nearer 5 million. That's the state we're in. Perversely, or maybe this was part of the intention, I don't know, it put home ownership out of the reach of between a quarter and a third of the population, something which has only got worse since. Council housing shrank to its record low, almost half to 2.5 million, almost half. And extraordinarily, and perversely, but again, I don't know whether this was part of the intention, that it's just a halfway house to privatisation, that a good third of all the properties bought under right to buy ended up in the hands and the clutches of private landlords who were keen on buy-to-let. The Tories then come back in 2010, and the situation again predictably has got worse. I mean, it is almost unaccountable to me that a new government in that situation should have more than halved capital expenditure on social housing. But that's exactly what they did. They cut it by 60%. They scrapped secure tenancies, brought in fixed-term tenancies. If you weren't caught by that, they introduced a means test, so that if the Tories are always talking about aspiration, as is New Labour, so if you do well by yourself and increase your income and improve your lot, then you lose your place because you can afford to go out into the private market. And of course, the bedroom tax. The bedroom tax, for which the justification which was alleged was that it's freeing up housing space for those who need it most, when it is blindingly obvious to everyone that the real problem is the failure to build the number of houses that people in the country need. And the Tories, of course, made it worse, again probably deliberately, by declining to deliver their promise that for every house that was given away with these huge discounts under right to buy would be replaced by another home. That never happened. And we have, I think, begun to see the new Rachmanism, where unscrupulous buy-to-let landlords have bought up masses of cheap property in London, East Ham and all over the place, packed it in with tenants, ignored their responsibilities as landlords in terms of repairs and maintenance and decent standards, and knowing perfectly well that they can push up the rents because they don't have to be paid by the tenant, it's paid by the taxpayer who is held hostage by a Tory government. That's the situation, and it is utterly, utterly dreadful. And I think it is an utter shame on both the main parties. So what should be done? Well, out of every crisis there is always an opportunity. That's a well-known political adage, and I think it is true here. The fact is, house building has a key role to play in what I think should be the central instrument of economic policy at this time, which is a counter-austerity policy. I totally agree with what Ruth said, that what we need is a Labour Party which unaccountably failed in the last 5 years to make clear that we're opposed to austerity. We don't back it, we're opposed to it, but we didn't. And I think we lost millions of votes as a result of that. But if you're going to have an opposition to austerity, and of course we have to meet the deficit, but that of course is the crisis leading to an opportunity. There are two ways of meeting a deficit or a debt. One is to cut expenditure, which of course is what Osborne has done. And the second, which is never mentioned, is to increase income. Now if you're an individual, it's very difficult to do that, probably impossible. You can't go to your employer and say, I'd like another 20 or 50 pounds, please. He'll laugh in your face. But if you're the state and you control economic policy, you control the pace and momentum of economic policy, that's quite a different matter. And that is the obvious way of dealing with austerity and the lack of house building. To use public investment, which Osborne would die before he ever did such a thing. But for the Labour Party, or any progressive movement, perhaps as a result of all that is happening and the political and social movement that is arising, we're going to see a very different Labour Party, or even possibly another party. But whoever it is, it certainly has to stress the role of public investment. To kickstart an economy towards sustainable growth, which is not what we've got at the moment, towards real jobs, not the 2 million 0 hours contracts, insecure, poorly paid jobs which you've got at the moment, increasing wages, increasing household income, therefore increasing government tax receipts and having the means to pay off the deficit a lot faster. And if you look at Osborne's way, never forget this. He said in 2010 he was going to cut the deficit to nil this year. It is actually £92 billion. So that route, even in his terms, is ruled out. And this is the obvious way. Now, the obvious question is, okay, if you're going to use public investment, what do you use it for? The obvious, overwhelming need is house building. Of course, there are other things, public infrastructure, in energy and transport, in IT, and preparing the way for a low-carbon economy. But house building should be absolutely central in this. Now, the obvious question which is going to be asked, so I'll answer it very quickly, is how do you pay for it? Because that's what Osborne would immediately say. Well, with interest rates at 0.5%, you can get a 30 billion package just for 150 million, which in government terms is peanuts. And with 30 billion, you could certainly get another 1 million to 1.5 million people into jobs, particularly in house building, but as I say, in other areas that which are needed as well, within a couple, certainly within 3 years. That's what is needed. But you don't actually need any increase in public borrowing at all. We own two banks in the public sector. You might not think so, but we actually own. We're paying for them, RBS and Lloyds. Why don't we tell them, and instead of frittering away our money in foreign speculation, they have to prioritise British industry, British manufacturing, British house building. We're perfectly able to do that. If they don't like it, we'll move the management out. And that's what the Tories will do, and we should be equally ruthless. Second alternative is something which no one's ever heard of, and it's actually very important, quantitative easing. It means printing money. It's a posh word for printing money. And there's nothing wrong with printing money so long as you use it profitably, not to consume for consumer expenditure and feeling a bit better in yourself, but creating productive enterprise. The government's already spent 375 billion. I'm quite prepared to limit my demand to a tenth of that. And with a tenth of that, we could do the things that I've just been talking about. The third, of course, is taxing the rich. You're meant to cheer at this point. Most audiences do. I mean, it is just incredible. I mean, you know, I wouldn't even go into this, what the rich are getting away with, the way they're being subsidised by the poor. And well, I'm not surprised. He's concerned about it as well. Anyway, those are, I think there is a real opportunity here to put house building first and an anti-austerity policy as a central objective of the Labour Party over the next 5 years. Now, there are just one or two things I want to say about, just to sort of qualify and a few caveats. First of all, I think a quarter to a third of all the new builds should be for social housing. Not affordable housing, which once one of those euphemisms which means slightly less unaffordable on the market rate. I mean social housing at 50% or so of the market rate. Secondly, I think local authorities should be encouraged to build using the collateral of their own housing stock if they've still got it, or borrowing at government borrowing rates which are less than the private market. Thirdly, housing revenue accounts which have been robbed over the last 10 years by the Treasury. 1.6 billion a year is a figure which is often quoted. Should be the council's own money. And I think that's very important, that it can't be used as a milk cow for the Treasury. And the proceeds of the proceeds of right to buy, how can I forget this? Well, possibly it's a Freudian slip. Right to buy, if it continues at all, should stay with local authorities. ALMOs, which are the arm's length management organisations, which are these artificial bodies which are set up as a sort of halfway house to privatisation, should all be brought back under the aegis of local authorities. It's local authorities who know the needs of their people. And I think that's, again, very important. Housing associations are very good at building up balances and reserves rather more than building houses, so bring them back to local authorities. Councils, I think, should be free to set rents. I mean, when are we at last going to see this? Not dominated by the Treasury or by central government, but by setting rents at levels which they know their people can reasonably pay. I think that's extremely important. Public sector rents are not a profit-making enterprise. That's what you might think they are, the way they're continually being pushed up, irrespective of capacity to pay. They are a social service for those who haven't a hope in hell of buying a house and certainly can't pay either the rents in the private sector. And the last point I would make here is that certainly we want to see a very different kind of council landlordism to what we've seen in the past. I mean, what we're hearing about East Ham is dreadful. Newham is dreadful. What we actually need is tenant involvement on their estates, the gold tenancies which will ensure fast repairs, and a points-based transfer system, again, operated by tenants. Now, once that's the core policy, in my view. Very quickly, everything else falls into place once you have got that in position. First of all, the private sector, the private rented sector, there are now 1.3 million families in the private rented sector. That number has doubled in the last 5 years. That's an extraordinary increase. And I think the policy is very obvious. Rebalance the housing market by a huge increase, and I mean a tripling, not a doubling as Labour was saying under Ed Miliband. That's a great improvement on what we've got at the moment. It's certainly nowhere near a tripling if we're actually going to meet not only existing demand from more elderly households, more single people, either who want to live alone or refugees from a broken marriage, or of course immigration. But we have to meet the waiting lists, as I say, which are enormous, and we need a tripling of house building in the public sector. And I think if you do that, you have the capacity to bring down prices. It'll happen slowly, but it will happen steadily. I think we obviously need to restore greater measures to constrain Rackmanite landlords to make sure they carry out their responsibilities, particularly with regard to security of tenure, particularly with regard to rent controls, and I would say giving local authorities increased rights to take, and this happens in my constituency, I'm very well aware of it. My Conservative opponent owns a hell of a lot of property and treats his tenants abominably. Now I was going to say I've got nothing against him, actually I've got a lot against him, but actually it's just a principle that local authorities should be able to take over from bad landlords the properties which they are abusing in the interests of tenants' rights. And lastly, the whole question of private ownership. I mean, the real problem here, of course, is the millions of young people who can no longer get on the housing ladder. The average house price in Britain today is 285,000. In London, it's $500,000, and there's not a hope in hell of many young people at the start of their careers being able to meet that. So what should the policy be? Well, I come back to the central point. If you treble house building in the private sector, I think there is a very good chance that it will bring down prices, but you can also ration demands on housing by limiting mortgages to 80% of the valuation, and a tax taxing the rich, particularly in this area of private ownership, by trebling stamp duty on those who have houses over 2 million, by making council tax much less regressive than it is at the moment, by extending the bands at the top end, and of course by the mansion tax. That's what I think the policy is. The situation is utterly dreadful at the moment. I think we owe an enormous debt to those who on the ground are actually taking the action that the Labour Party ought to be taking. Yeah, and we owe a great tribute to you, and we ought to be supporting you in every way we can. And there is a significant section of the Labour Party, let me say, not robbing Wales, but there is a significant section who are determined to do this and will support you in demonstrations and in direct action. And maybe we will actually, in the end, see a Labour leadership contestant, applicant, who actually adopts this policy. If so, I think he will succeed.